You know what I really liked about that, and I wish I could say it as eloquently as Suzanne Ayler said earlier. This is a tragedy, the devastation of these cyclones, but there are ways we can help people that may also help them develop in new and important ways that we wouldn't have been able to before. And so this kind of situation where you see women really taking charge and finding new opportunities out of great tragedy, I think is an area of hope that we can really look to try to work to expand as we move forward. So now I will turn it over to Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll stand up.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Goldenberg. First of all, I just wanted to say how happy I am to be here because I come to the issue of climate change from a background as a war reporter at The Guardian. And when I first took up the climate change beat in 2009, I was asked so many times, how can you leave behind those big picture stories of covering war and conflict to something like climate change? And I always argued that these issues are so connected. It's the same issue. It's an issue of justice. And, because climate change is, the impacts of climate change are going to be so unequal and are going to fall particularly hard on women, particularly hard on areas of conflict where government is weak, and particularly hard on the poor in this country and in other countries. And so I'm really glad to be here moderating this panel with these speakers who are going to sort of talk to these issues from the front lines of these issues. I'm going to sort of lead off in this direction. The first speaker is Kelly Fish, who comes from Project Concern International, where she's a gender technical advisor. She has dealt with issues of gender violence on the front line, including 7 years on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. And she's going to be talking to us about resilience and capacity building to meet some of the challenges that are going to be coming down the pike with climate change. Next up, we have Jacqueline Patterson, who directs the Environment and Climate Justice Program at the NAACP, and she's going to be talking about some of the impacts that we see here in this country with the Deepwater Horizon and the other events that have been going on around the country, Flint, for example. And finally, we'll be rounding off the panel with Swati Veeravalli, who is a research scientist with the Army Corps of Engineers. She comes to the topic with a water background from her work in Kenya, and I think we'll be speaking to some of the issues that we saw at the very beginning of the set of films just now. So I'm looking forward to the discussions that are going to be taking place just now. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kelly Fish, and as Suzanne said, I am PCI's Technical Advisor for Gender. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I've been working in this field for about 15 years, so I've really had a great opportunity to see these issues from a variety of vantage points. And, when I was trying to think about a story today for where these issues really crystallized for me, it took me back to my time in Eastern Chad, where I was leading a gender-based violence program for those Darfuri refugees in the early years of the Darfur conflict there. And in all the camps I visited and consultations with men, women, and youth, I kept hearing a common story. When women and girls would go to collect firewood, when they would try to use a latrine, go to collect water, they were not safe. Women and girls are being physically, sexually, and emotionally violated. And while the ethnic cleansing dynamic of the Darfur conflict was the headliner, there were also underlying conflicts between agriculturalists and pastoralists. Women and girls who bore an unprecedented brunt of the atrocities in Darfur found themselves with innumerable safety and security risks within their so-called refugee camp safe havens. Darfuri refugees fled atrocities only to be hosted by communities who were nearly as vulnerable and secure due to desertification, environmental degradation, and political instability. So a few years later, kind of connected to this same topic, I was working in Kenya with one of the most prominent climate justice activists of our time, Nobel Peace Laureate Wangari Maathai. And she was remarking on her experience visiting Sudan, and she describes flying over Western Darfur and asking herself the very simple question, where are the trees? To her, that was the simplest way to frame what was going on. Where are the trees? As many of you know, Wangari Maathai had a simple vision of planting and protecting trees and encouraging her fellow women to do the same. She understood that this not only positively impacted forest, but the watershed, women's economic empowerment, livelihoods, and ultimately women's increased agency and voice. In my time supporting her activism on the African continent, highlighting the critical connection between gender and climate justice, I came to believe that simple, everyday tasks have the potential for the greatest sustainable impact. While women and girls are no doubt made more vulnerable by climate change and conflict, we seek to shift the paradigm from one of victim to one of actor with agency. I think in this room, we are all familiar with the case for why we should be targeting women and girls. We have the business case, the human rights moral case, sustainability. Conflict, disaster, emergencies, through the breakdown of social fabrics, open up unintended space for women to challenge the status quo, to occupy public spaces that were previously taboo. And while conflict can create opportunities for women, safety issues, and particularly those due to the backlash against women, threatens what gains women make. So more than putting women and girls at the center of what we do, we have to listen and create space for them to drive what we do. I think that's some of the messages that we've been hearing so far today. So at PCI, even though we put women and girls at the center of everything we do, we know that women and girls do not live in silos. They do not live on a little island by themselves. And we can't be successful in supporting women's empowerment and gender equality without the full engagement and participation of men, boys, and other critical stakeholders. So no matter how many inputs and resources we put in the hands of women, if they do not have control, agency, decision-making power, and even basic self-confidence, those investments are not going to be maximized. At PCI, our development-focused health, hardship, and hunger work builds in sustainability and resilience to ensure communities can pivot when an emergency strikes or in a disaster. We believe in the do no harm, bottom-up approach, which for us essentially means we believe that those who are affected by the disaster know the context much better than we do, that they are the ones who have the solutions to offer, not us. We seek to work with families and communities to build their own resilience and ability to weather shocks and stresses through an asset-based approach. One way that we do this, which we see tremendous potential for expanding, is through PCI's platform program, the Women Empowered Initiative. So this initiative is a savings-led social and economic empowerment platform that, in addition to building women's economic empowerment and capital and livelihoods, seeks to support those more intangible yet essential qualities, including self-confidence, joint decision-making, leadership, and self-efficacy. In emergencies, if women have access to savings, it cushions them and their families from shocks and stresses. When women have control over money and resources, they are more likely to make decisions that are beneficial to their families. Oh, I'm out of time? Okay.
You're nearing the...
Okay, well, let me fast forward a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about PCI's work, and I don't know if I have a clicker. Oh, I grab that. Mm-hmm. I knew I was going to be tough on that time. So I want to skip ahead. There's a few other comments that I wanted to make, but I'll hopefully get the opportunity later. But I wanted to talk a little bit about our programs and how we're responding to the current crisis called by the El Nino weather system that has been coupled with problems that we've seen from climate change. And particularly for women empowered groups that we've been working with, you know, we have seen the amazing ability of these groups to build their own resiliency, and when a crisis emerges, that they are able to pivot and respond to the needs and demands presented by disaster and climate change. So in Liberia, this meant that our women empowered groups were able to pivot and use their economic capital as well as their social capital that they gained from participating in these women empowered groups to help respond and be leaders in the community-led Ebola prevention efforts. Similarly, in Ethiopia, we were told that it would not work to try to do a program like this in Ethiopia, that women would not be able to save. But we have seen over the years that women indeed were able to save, and that they've been able to use their funds to help to make sure their animals get vaccinated, or use those funds for their family's health and well-being. And then I'm going to skip Malawi and just go straight to Guatemala. I was in Guatemala last month, and similarly, again, the El Nino weather system is greatly affecting food security there as well. And I had the great opportunity to meet with, this is a farmer leader and a mother leader, and PCI had engaged them in a workshop, a training on gender issues. And I was struck by the amazing initiative that these two took. They came back to their community and decided to organize a community event where they would be able to share a little bit about what they learned during this gender training, all on their own. And it really enabled them to share their learnings. And immediately following this event, 3 women from the community were able to join their local women empowered group. So finally, husbands and partners and fathers of those women were able to see the benefit of why their partners should be able to participate in these economic activities. So I will just close by saying, this young man here who told me while we were talking there in Guatemala that maybe if I can make some small changes in my home, my neighbors can follow my example. So I just want to close by saying that, there's nothing about us without us, and that sometimes the solutions to very complicated problems can be very simple. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm afraid Kelly bore the brunt of my neglecting to remind everyone about the 5-minute rule and the single anecdote here. So just to leave, I'm sure there'll be lots of people wanting to ask questions, so to leave time for that.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you. So I am just going to talk a little bit about some of the pre-existing vulnerabilities that make women more likely to be impacted by disasters here in the United States. A little bit about some of the impacts using some of the examples that we've experienced through the various disasters we've worked on, and a little bit about the prescription for the way we need to plan for more gender-responsive emergency management, all in 5 minutes. Now 4 minutes in. So in terms of pre-existing vulnerabilities, we found that this has really been at the core, our failure to really address the pre-existing vulnerabilities. Everything from employment insecurity to just general economic insecurity, food, and under that, food insecurity, housing insecurity. We also find that I'll talk a little bit more about intersectionality and how we're finding certain communities, certain populations more impacted even within women. So, for example, women of color, women of different country origins, and so forth. Also, the digital divide is an issue as it relates to having access to information. The issues around mobility have been an issue around disasters and differential access to mobility. And then some of the health status issues have also been issues in terms of pre-existing vulnerabilities. Some of the examples of the intersectionality, as I talked about, race, country of origin, ableism, in terms of, we found a lot in terms of disability rights there, and also gender identities. And so we find these challenges in the whole emergency management continuum, whether it's a preparation for disasters, during disasters, in the disaster management process, and the marginalization of certain communities in the disaster management process, and how certain communities actually end up worse off thanks to a very deeply flawed system. Two, in the aftermath in terms of redevelopment, who really has access to redevelopment resources, who's able to return, who's worse off than they were before the disaster permanently as a result of a system that fails to really accommodate the needs and the assets of the communities. And so, as it relates to some of the disasters that we've worked with specifically, we found in the context of Hurricane Katrina, for example, that we had women who were unable to, who because they were and this is one of the issues as well, the women tend to be more often with children than men are in disaster context. So when it comes to trying to get out, then women are trying to get out not only themselves, but also trying to accommodate getting their children out as well. Often the ones who are trying to find children as well if they don't happen to be with their children, which then slows down their ability to escape. So we heard many stories of that in the context of Katrina. We also heard many stories of Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot about my slides. One of the stories that we heard was from Shana Griffin, who gave this quote, "I'm crying as I write. I found out 2 days ago that Charmaine Neville, like hundreds of other women, was raped during the storm." So this issue of sexual violence during disaster we've already spoken about is one that really was very acute during the context of Hurricane Katrina. As I spoke about before, people who are permanently displaced, people who now are living in Houston, who are living in Arkansas, who are living in Arizona. Sorry, I know you keep looking at your time. I have 2 minutes left, I think. Who are living in different places as a result of not being able to be restored to home because of the pre-existing vulnerabilities that have made it less likely for them to be able to come back. In the aftermath of the flooding and the storms of 2011 that happened in Alabama and in Mississippi, there was a woman called Mrs. Clark she had saved up her whole life to be able to retire in the country, and that home in the blink of an eye was ravaged by this tornado, and she didn't have homeowners insurance. She had saved up to be able to get the home and build the home, but she hadn't saved up enough to be able to maintain homeowners insurance, and FEMA wasn't enough for her, so she then was permanently displaced after those disasters. In the context of the BP disaster, when we look at police blotters for domestic violence, they were 10 times as much in certain cases. We also had a situation where there were ICE raids in the context of the BP disaster in terms of people who are doing the cleanup duty. And so people who were people of different country origins, and again, women who are trying to make a livelihood for their children and so forth, who are trying to get whatever jobs are available there, got swept up in these ICE raids and were deported as a result. We have we mentioned Flint here. In that disaster, again, because it's disproportionately affecting children because of and also women of childbearing years, we see those kind of impacts in terms of women now having to care for children who are lead impacted, whether it's behavior issues that they're going to see down the line or educational issues that they then are going to have to account for because of the permanent brain damage that these children face. And again, so this is just an image of kind of the escape situation and the differential access to being mobile, and more on that same thing. And this is actually an important point that I will close with, because I think I'm at 5 minutes pretty much, is that this really struck me in terms of who was on stage. White men, largely, who were from local government, who were from the Red Cross, who were from FEMA, who were in the position of giving out information, who had resources, who had control, then lined up at the mic.
Where is this?
This is in, Huntsville, Alabama. And then lined up at the mic, the people who needed information, who needed resources, 3 African-American women. So I took that picture and put the juxtaposition together to really tell that story. And I have another picture that shows the people who were inside in the food line in the same place. And down to a person, the people who were giving out the food were white American, and down to a person, the people who were receiving the food were African American. And what also struck me is that the people who were in the food line were the men, while the women were out here getting the information. So I will close on that note, because I know we'll talk more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to start by reading a quote from the Global Study on the Implementation for the UN Security Council 1325, but at the risk of time, I'll probably try and end with that if there is time. So beginning, I think that based on empirical observations, we know that the impacts of climate change, while spatially variable and largely identity blind, will affect certain identity groups, especially women, such as we've discussed already, disproportionately more. And we know also that the impacts of a complex emergency will depend on the very social context within which it occurs, and that this socially constructed vulnerability extends to the contextual gender and power relations that our previous panelists have already talked about. So I really have 2 key points that I'd like to underscore for today. And that the first, echoing Kelly Fish's remarks, is that climate change has significant impacts on women. But secondly, by creating a gendered response to climate change impacts, it actually offers the most opportunity to increase resiliency and agency perhaps, and perhaps also decrease vulnerability. So to my first key point, that climate change will have significant impacts upon women. We know that gender inequality further exacerbates the risks and vulnerabilities related to climate change and disasters, as well as in conflict. For example, during a complex emergency, women and girls are frequently subjected to intimidation, gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and rape. Women and girls also face an even more serious risk with the onslaught of climate-induced disasters, which includes organized trafficking. Climate-related disasters such as floods, droughts, or famine may disrupt local safety nets, leaving women and children unaccompanied, separated, or orphaned due to the erosion and breakdown of normal social controls as well as protections, which makes them exceedingly vulnerable, a point that we're hearing over and over again, to the exploitations of, for example, violence as well as trafficking. After a natural disaster, economic and security challenges may lead women who are in charge of households and livelihoods to seek temporary relief and shelter and amenable living conditions in acutely insecure contexts, making them even more potential targets for exploitation and trafficking. Therefore, insecure disaster regions must be considered as potential areas for such harmful activities, and further examination is required. If we turn to a quick case study on what's happening in Mindanao in the Philippines right now, we witness how women, in a sense, really experience entrenched vulnerability there. Prior to the disaster in 2006, since 2006, overall poverty in Mindanao has steadily increased. In 2009, there were over 8 million people living in poverty, and of this, 60% were women. The situation has also been made worse by the complexities between government instability, conflict, and climate-induced disasters. Whether a climate or conflict, it's women from these poor communities that we've witnessed so far who are the worst affected, having little education, property, or say sometimes in the decisions that affect them. Moving to my second key point, we also know that the response of climate change will have to have a gendered component to it. So changing the conversation, let's examine the nuances of how vulnerability prior to, during, and post a complex emergency can actually be viewed in the lens of an opportunity, again, underscoring the comments that the previous panelists have made. By being aware of gender issues during complex emergencies, we begin to see that an opportunity presents itself to increase the adaptive capacity or agency, and therefore potentially bolster resiliency of women. We can recognize the already dynamic and varied roles that women play with regard to natural resource management and conflict mitigation, and how these could continually be harnessed to continue improving stability outcomes. I think we should strive to dovetail both development objectives as well as climate change adaptation objectives. For example, focusing on how women can take an active role to ensure family survival and engagement through income-generating activities, as we witnessed in the previous video. We can also underscore how women's engagement in both micro and macro level decision-making processes with respect to resource allocation, use, investment, and planning for or where to move to settle should occur. And both these examples provide ways to embed long-term development adaptation objectives so that during an emergency, women actually become less vulnerable. If we end with a case study in Nepal, after the earthquake, the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs created gender profiles that included weekly and monthly updates on gender mainstreaming, and in effect created a guidance on gender mainstreaming in transition processes. Towards this goal, the Gender Working Group was created to provide an inter-cluster coordination mechanism to raise gender equality issues and support the realization of gender-responsive programming in the work and clusters of the humanitarian action phase, as well as to enhance the cross-learning and good practices across the clusters. The Gender Working Group is both co-chaired by the UN Women as well as UN OCHA, in line with the commitments it's set in the Global Memorandum of Understanding between the two agencies. And it consists of gender focal points nominated by each clusters, which is a great example of how we're elevating this conversation of gender and climate change adaptation as well as development. So before I conclude, I think that based upon the previous comments of my panelists, as well as what we've seen in the video, we can see that climate change can actually present an opportunity to facilitate stability through unconventional approaches. By facilitating gender equality prior to, then during a disaster and post a disaster, it is possible to therefore reduce vulnerability and perhaps, again, increase resiliency. Ensuring gender sensitivity is critical for effective climate change adaptation, but we do need to understand the gender nuances and dynamics, and in doing so, we realize that not all vulnerability is perhaps bad. Climate change is elevating current conversations and putting a spotlight on gender inequality by leveraging the work that the development community has already invested in. Am I? Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all. And left to me, I would have let everybody go on and on. I think it's a great topic. I just want to pick up on some of the themes that both of you, that Kelly and Jackie sort of dealt with, and I think Swati kind of synthesized so nicely. And that's that climate change exposes the vulnerabilities that women are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And yet, as Kelly said, that they need to, have agency. And if they are given agency, they are, the solution to climate change in terms of helping communities sort of protect against future climate change. So I want to pick up on the way that Swati seemed to put these two together and to sort of ask whether, in your view, we now need to reframe broadly the way we all think about climate change. And maybe it's a feminist issue. Is climate change the ultimate feminist issue? And should we mobilize around climate change that way?
Sarah, me?
I'm sorry, whoever wants to pick it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say absolutely. I think that, that as we know, and we've seen a lot of research around when there is, that nexus of conflict, of climate change, of disaster, we see breakdown of social fabric. We really see that there is, we're always framing it as, poor victims, poor women, poor children. But I do think that there is an opportunity that women can especially seize on when, it opens up space for them to occupy roles that maybe they weren't allowed to before. So playing more of a breadwinner role for their family but we also see the other side where, sometimes that makes men feel emasculated if they're not the primary breadwinner in their family or able to play that role that they've been, told that they need to play. So, yeah, I think, I definitely think it is very much a feminist issue. It's a very, complicated issue, and I think my colleagues here might have something to add.
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly a feminist issue in the sense that it brings it's a kind of a threat multiplier for all the various issues that we already experience, and that are dealt with through women's empowerment and through a more gendered focused view of society, I guess. And so in particular, when we talk about reducing vulnerabilities for climate change, it's like we're reducing vulnerability for everything else that differentially impacts women and folks with different gender identities. So when I'm doing this work around emergency management, we really try to talk about how to not just deal with making disasters less harmful for people who are poor, but actually, having economic empowerment so people aren't poor, instead of making it so that people who are of different races are experiencing climate change less or, less severely. Let's talk about dealing with racism. So we really see the impacts of climate change, including disaster, as something that kind of brings out all the societal ills that we need to address at their root.
Can I just say yes?
You can say yes, or you can add. You sort of did seem to be proposing that in the beginning.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, again, sort of reiterating what I said before, I think climate change, we know, affects women disproportionately. So that being said, I mean, the development community has tried to raise the awareness of how long, say, women take to walk to water, and that's something a key point that we saw before. But I think the climate change offers adds a sense of urgency to why we need to normalize this the gender inequality that exists in the U.S., like you highlighted, as well as globally everywhere else. So yes.
And so how do we start to do that? I mean, what's the sort of, you could wave the magic wand? Is it income inequality? Is it, this is an issue where sort of race, sex, class all come together. Is it income inequality, or is it violence, against women?
I think if I had to say, and really trying to see, that women don't exist in a vacuum in one specific event, whether it's an emergency or a disaster, and really seeing that continuum from, an emergency, disaster, and development. And I would say really the focus on those negative social norms and challenging roles, attitudes, and behaviors that are really going to be what are the game changers in this realm. So I think whether we're talking about in emergency or disaster, or doing more general resilience and development work around climate change. It's really fundamentally about trying to change hearts and minds and see people increasingly practice those positive gender norms. And I think gender equality is really the foundation. If we don't have gender equality, I don't think we're going to have climate justice.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think that there is no magic wand. Sad to say, I'd love to see one, but I think that all of these is we need to really just change our society from one that's built on domination and extraction to one that's built on regenerative, cooperative, resilient models of how we structure our societies and our communities and our systems. But I think that's sounds somewhat utopian when we talk about that's where we need to go. But where are the steps in between? So even taking this example of women being vulnerable and walking to get water, I was in South Africa doing a focus group, and the women talked about wanting to have female-controlled condoms so that they could actually just wear them all the time when they go and get water, because that was the level of risk that they felt that they had. And that was one of the most chilling things that I've ever heard in my life, I would say. And so we need to do that. We need to do that while we also work towards gender equality, so that women don't have to face that risk when they're going out and getting water, and so that we also deal with the fact that we're on this catastrophic slide towards climate change, so we reverse climate change. So while we're doing those bigger things, we also need to think about all of these things that we need to do in the meantime to keep women safe.
What do you, I was wondering, after having been through a disaster which does challenge traditional gender roles, I was sort of struck by your picture of that it was the women who were getting the information and the men who were standing in line on the food, sort of. Do things just go back to how they were before? Is there any sort of lasting change, equalization? Do the position of women get worse? I mean, what's the after effects of having been through a catastrophe like that?
Well, it's interesting. In the context of Flint, what's been very interesting actually in that situation is that it is the women who are in the lead in terms of a real community-led response to developing solutions. So most of the times when you hear folks talking about Flint, then it's the women who are really taking charge. And again, I think that's partially tied to the fact that we know that children who are being disproportionately impacted. So it's that kind of traditional women and children thing. So definitely in a for better or worse category, but also we see that as a kind of a shift, and the fact that it's a female mayor as well as of Flint. So we have really kind of in seeing that and in seeing the successes that are coming out of women's leadership in that context, hopefully that will also inspire other contexts to really look at gender or female leadership in those contexts. So I think that there's precedent that's being set because women are being forced into leadership in some ways by circumstances and other ways.
And Swati, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in there. If not, I had another question for you.
Not on that specific.
Oh, I was wondering, you talked about capacity building and increasing the capacity of women for adaptation, buttressing communities against future climate change. So how might that start? Is that how would you begin with that task?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Kelly you were talking about how to increase agency and empowerment, which I think it's a great way to begin. But your earlier question was about is it income inequality or violence? And I would say it's both, right? Because prior to the emergency, prior to the complex disaster, if you have good income, you have access to an emergency fund, then your relative vulnerability becomes a little bit less vulnerable, right? So it's really a spectrum, and then you've got the other end of the spectrum, which is armed conflict and violence, and we were talking about rape earlier. I was reading somewhere that during a disaster, if you just provide access to lighting, so just light bulbs, the incidence of rape go down immediately. And so Kelly was talking about a paradigm shift, and I think that it's really sort of a mindset, simple mindset changes like that. Are we providing for lactating mothers? We saw a lot of mothers in the video during a disaster. Where are they going to be able to breastfeed their children? Just things that require a little bit of foresight, perhaps prior to the event, and that's why I think that we could queue up the lessons learned from development.
That's great. I'm going to open it up to the floor because I'm sure people have questions. The microphone will come to you. If you could start by, saying your name and identify your organization, and then ask a question, that'd be great.
Gaines, that way.
Sorry.
And if you wanted to direct it to a particular panelist, or
How do we sustain?
was that towards a particular panelist?
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I repeated the question. I've done my duty.
Yeah, I think, as I said, we've made the case over and over for why investment in these issues is so important, why putting women and girls at the center of everything we do is so important. There's the business case, there's the human rights case, it's just the right thing to do. And I think it really takes sustained pressure and, both on donors, on all actors to really keep it at the forefront. And I think, I was having an interesting conversation during the lunch about, that people get the why, and we've been trying to do more about the how, but really putting that into practice and making sure that we're resourcing, financing those initiatives is really the challenge. So, and seeing those through. So, yeah, I think that's a big part of it is keeping, we need to have that partnership. We need to hear the voices of the people doing the advocacy. We can't stay in our silos of, here's the practitioners over here, here's the donors over here, here's the communities over here. So I think that it's really, essential. We keep talking about, integration and multi-sectoral work, and, it still is, something that we're not doing great. We're trying, and we're moving in that direction, but I think that that's really how I would come about that.
Yeah, and I would just add I think we also need more empirical research on how this works and why this works. I think there's a lot of evidence there, and we need to continue to bring that up in order to sustain that conversation. And I think dialogues like this are just a great example of how we are continuing to sustain that conversation, and then how you go on to your own organizations or academic institutions and continue this dialogue that, you've already elevated some of the key points here are going to be key to sustaining the conversation.
I was just going to ask, I don't know whether any of you wanted to weigh in it, but just having the, Paris Climate Conference had a big sort of involvement from business groups, campaign groups. The Obama administration has, come out and, made a big public campaign about climate change. Do those efforts help broaden the discussion beyond government officials, beyond development professionals to involving communities? And, have you felt an impact in the last year or so?
I was involved in the COP10, so I'm in Copenhagen, so I'm a little bit more rusty on what happened in Paris.
Okay, yeah, that was a disaster.
Yeah, do you want me to? Do you want to go? Sorry.
Sure. Okay. Sure. I don't necessarily think that COP21 advanced a conversation around getting. I think that in some ways, COP21 and the importance that people were placing on it actually propelled communities to be more visible. Like you had more grassroots participation in COP21 than you've seen in a long time. And so I don't think it. I don't think that there was. I think it was more that the communities propelled themselves into the center of the conversation than anything. And I don't think it was necessarily the COP21 or President Obama or so forth that thrust communities more into it as much as communities in their own agency doing so, I would say, because they recognize the importance of that space and the stage that it provided in terms of their voices actually being heard for once, as opposed to what's happened up until now.
Yeah, some of the work that we do with the Army Corps is some engagements in international contexts, and part of that work is making sure that the right people are in the room to talk about climate change adaptation. So this type of work is largely unaffected by sort of Paris climate commitments and other agreements, because I think at the community and the grassroots level, it continues. There's sort of there's a momentum going that is being echoed, that's being picked up by larger, overarching sort of multilateral agreements. But I think that we are trying to make little waves at the sort of micro level.
Okay. I think there's two in the same row.
Yes.
Mm.
Who would like
Sure.
to take that?
I think I don't know if I'm very qualified to answer that, but I mean, I think that, again, that climate change is helping raise some of these issues. I mean, racism has always been there, right? I mean, and then you add the word climate or environment in front of it, and it becomes a different thing, but it's really just the same thing. I mean, we've always had discrimination between classes, different identity groups, and so I think then you force the climate sort of forces a different lens to it, which is interesting to interrogate, and I think the NAACP is doing a lot of great work on that, and especially understanding sort of deconstructing how Hurricane Katrina happened and sort of the response aspects. I think there were some really good questions that were asked, and perhaps I think there were some successes in Hurricane Sandy response, if I could be so bold to say that. So I think it's a great question. So.
Yeah, I think that there's so many ways that climate change, as I said before, is a threat multiplier and just kind of really lifts up in some ways a lot of these pre-existing structural and institutionalized divisions that continue, really. I mean, you mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers. One thing that the Army Corps of Engineers in 2012, I think, in the aftermath of Hurricane Isaac, which had really devastated Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana, the Army Corps of Engineers was asked by Senator Mary Landrieu why it was they hadn't fortified those levees 7 years after Katrina when they were doing all the levee fortification work. And they said that they used a formula to decide where they're going to fortify levees, and the formula applied points based on what the economic impact would be if the levee was overtaken only. And so when we have this intersection between gender and economic equality, for example, we have formulas that institutionalize the death or the loss of livelihood or whatever of women and other vulnerable groups that are disproportionately in the lower end of the income inequality. And there's so many different ways that those types of institutionalized discrimination that keeps the protection and so forth in the corner of people who have means or people who have political power. So yeah. Do
you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would just add, on a programmatic level, when we are doing our work, we really try to do gender analysis and really see things through a gender lens, which also looks at intersectionality, looking at age, looking at ability, looking at gender identities. And I think what's helped some of our work and helped give us a mandate has really been the increase in our donors, especially the U.S. government, having the gender equality and female empowerment policy. That's really kind of pushed us, and I think those of us working in the gender sphere have really appreciated that has pushed our organizations and given us more of a mandate to make sure that we are doing a better job and that we are tailoring our approaches to those different needs and varying needs of different people that we are trying to work with.
Thanks. And then there was a woman in the middle.
Thanks a lot. My name's Dorcas Robinson. I'm from CARE, and I wanted to go back to the point about how we increase adaptive capacities. I mean, we're one organization that's been working for a number of years now with community-based adaptation approaches to working at community level with different groups, with local governments, for example, and increasingly looking at the national adaptation planning process. So I guess I just wanted to say that I think what's important there is that there are discrete ways of working around pre-existing efforts around education or health or agriculture, for example, where we can actually work with communities quite effectively to for communities to talk about what's changing and to really think about opportunities for action, and in fact start to demonstrate that there's a return on investment in doing that. But I think my comment really is, I think we're in a space right now where there's a lot of emphasis on adaptation, which seems to be quite focused on infrastructure. And I think at a policy level, we have to really keep attention on making sure that there is investment straight, direct to the grassroots where people need it now to be able to adapt to climate change impacts.
You mean investing in human capital?
Yes.
Did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I actually have been on a number of advisory groups around adaptation and really just threw a tantrum at the end of one of them. We were doing evaluation because they considered outcomes to be, stormwater management system development or whatever that thing is, that infrastructure thing being built. And I was saying we have to have outcomes that really focus on like how many people were flooded out of their homes after this next disaster. And so, when we look at indicators, we need to look at indicators around social capital, capital and the extent to which social capital exists in a community, and then after whatever intervention the social capital has been built. And so we need to really think about what those pre-existing vulnerabilities are, how to plan for those pre-existing vulnerabilities, and how to really be outcome focused as it relates to kind of the people that we're seeking to protect, or the people that we're seeking to empower, or whatever it is that the set of outcomes are. And so but I'm not alone, fortunately, in that group I was, that's the tantrum. but there's a growing set of folks who are really focused on equity-based adaptation planning that really looks at holistic models that define resilience in a more kind of that are rooted in community leadership and those kind of indicators of what resilience actually is. And so, unfortunately, there's a couple of like the Kresge Foundation. I would actually like to call them out as facilitating a group of people who are really specifically looking at equity and resilience building, and really looking at holistic models of resilience building that are focused on systems change. And so there's a community of folks like the Movement Strategy Center, Emerald Cities Collaborative, who are a part of that cohort of folks who are looking at in the Climate Justice Alliance, who are really looking at systems change rooted, community rooted change. So thank you for that.
I wanted to sort of pick up on that and ask, is there a need, do you think, for sort of scientific research to show how that kind of investment pays off compared to spending millions on sort of seawalls and floodgates and stuff? Is that, if you can talk us through some of the research on that, or is there a need for more research?
Yeah, there definitely is a need for more research, because I found myself we actually put out a document called Equity and Resilience Building for Climate Adaptation, not too creative, and it was an indicators document, and it was born out of, again, my frustration, and it was a set of indicators that say this is what we should be looking for when we think about building resilience in the context of adaptation. And I did an exhaustive literature review before that, and there was just too little out there already in existence. There was nothing like what I had put together, but there were smatterings of it out there. So that's to say, absolutely, we need much more, because I'm not even a researcher. So me putting together an indicators list was just crazy. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I would add that I think that the source of resiliency is the people as well as infrastructure, right? It's sort of a dual-pronged approach. I mean, we do need seawalls, but we also need sort of the people to be in the right places so that the seawalls can be most effective. It doesn't help if there's a gajillion-dollar seawall and then you have a very marginalized community living right there at that sort of 2 meter impact component. So it's really both, and so that's where the sources of vulnerability can come from. A colleague of mine likes to say her favorite thing to do is to look at previous disasters and see what we can learn from previous disasters. And that way, like you mentioned, I think Hurricane Katrina was a watershed moment for the U.S. Like, what are the things that we didn't do right? We thought we had right, but we didn't do right. And I think that, again, that Hurricane Sandy really showed that, like, lessons learned approach is quite successful.
Hi, so Roger Mark D'Souza at the Wilson Center. So, Swati, I wanted to ask you about this, but I'd be interested in hearing your perspectives also. So those of us who work in the peacemaking space, so those of us dealing with conflict management and mitigation, what is the receptivity to the conflict and peace-building space to connecting these issues in a real and meaningful way? So we look at climate change, fragility, environmental security, and we know that there's a lot of work on women and peace building, but I'm still feeling that there's a gap and an opportunity here. And how can we talk about those connections in a way that we in the United States recognize that this is in our national security interests? Could we explore those connections a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great comments, and I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that there's many definitions of climate security and environmental security, but I think that those definitions are often synonymous with national security. And so when we're looking at sort of the impacts of climate change, and we're looking at the impacts of environmental degradation, once we start understanding how vulnerabilities can exist in those spheres, then we are addressing issues of national security. And again, Katrina and Hurricane Sandy are great examples of that. And I think that we need to continue exploring in a meaningful way, as well as in an empirical way, what these connections between conflict and climate change and conflict and stability and women can be, because I think too often it's easy to say climate causes war, right? That conversation is useful for to get people in the room, but it's not really telling us anything, and it's sort of sensationalist, and we really need to deconstruct and analyze that. And I know that's the work of the work that you're doing at the Wilson Center, and along with investments made by agencies such as USAID as well as other organizations. I think we should just continue having these conversations.
Yeah, there's a quote that I often use in my presentations from a Somali-born Kenyan poet, Warsan Shire, where she says, "You have to understand that a mother wouldn't put her child into a boat unless the water is safer than the land." And it really is a very powerful quote that kind of talks about some of the relationship. And we talk about kind of climate change in the context of climate forced migration and the responsibility that the U.S. bears for climate change. For example, being 4% of the population, but 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. And so when people, and so our immigration policy is, and our immigration attitudes, and we've heard even what happened today around if people have been paying attention, not that you wouldn't be paying attention, but if you split your attention from what's happening here versus what's happening out there, but we know that our immigration policy is about, again, we know people talking about building walls and keeping people out instead of recognizing our own responsibility for people, this forced migration that's happening. So I think that that's something that to be talked about, and also in terms of the resource wars, but then also the slippery slope that we get on when we talk about security and climate change in a way that that people have done in a negative way, and to kind of further reinforce the wall strategy and so forth. So I think as you said before, the work of the Wilson Center is important in terms of really being able to have responsible dialogue about that connection with security. In a way that really uplifts human rights, but and recognizes the U.S. responsibility for where we are in terms of on this catastrophic slide towards climate change. So, yeah, that'll be my thought.
Maybe I would just add, something that came to mind when you asked that question was the framework that we have from UN Security Council Resolution 1325, what gave this mandate for women's inclusion and all parts of peace building globally. And still the tremendous road we have to go to ensuring that is effectively happening. And so I think, again, I think back to the last panel and that connection to having, that conducive policy environment, and how do we actually translate that into action. And I think there is such a strong, peace building and women's rights movement globally in countries and communities. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to tap those activists and bring them more into the conversation, because I think that there is, that essential link, and we, again, get kind of stuck in our silos and really have a hard time crossing those lines and really building those conversations.
I'll look out and see if there's... Yes?
Hello, my name is Kara Turnger, and I'm also with the Wilson Center. And when we talk about resilience, we often talk about macro scale resilience. How do we make resilient nations, resilient communities? But we never really talk about individual resilience. And especially given that with climate change, entire nations are going to have to move away from their ancestral homelands. What work and what systems needs to be done to improve individual resilience, especially in the areas of mental and emotional health?
There's a great network called the International Transformational Resilience Coalition that that has come up over the last couple of years. This fellow, Dr. Bob Doppelt, has put that together, and it consists of mental health professionals, social workers. I'm in it as a social worker, and others who are really speaking about that very thing. And unfortunately, not enough people are, but there is a growing through that network. There's a growing set of people who are coming together around that conversation and around building resilience. as you said, at the individual level, building coping strategies, looking at mental health and how we need to be redefining mental health in the context of these big changes that people are experiencing. And then also looking at the whole issue of human rights defenders or community leadership and the greater burden that those folks are facing differentially in terms of holding the psyche of a community as a leader when there's that level of burden and devastation that people are experiencing, whether it's disasters or displacement or as you said, pending having to move entire communities. You know, Thibodaux, Louisiana is losing a football field size amount of land per hour. And as you know, that group was just moved on the Pointe-aux-Chien tribe in Ile-de-Jean-Charles. And so so that's all to say, it's happening, but not obviously at the scale it's needed, but it is happening. I would definitely refer you, if you wanted to hear more about that, to that particular group.
Yeah, I think we need, in order to create or facilitate that individual resilience, I think we need more understanding of what adaptive capacity is. And my definition of adaptive capacity is the ability to cope. So if you don't have the ability to cope, then you cannot be resilient in any way, shape, or form. And so I think we do need more research. And perhaps our colleagues from CARE who are doing some work on adaptive capacity right now could comment on that. But I think that, especially from the micro level, if we don't have an understanding of what an individual adaptive capacity could be to any type of event, then they become vulnerable, right? The potential for vulnerability becomes much greater. And so, if we have more frameworks and more programmatic efforts targeting adaptive capacity, I think then that's when you start trying to affect the resilience spectrum a little bit more. So, but it's a great question.
Yes, it was. It's been a great conversation, but we do have to wrap up. I wanted to ask if there was one takeaway that you wanted people in the audience to go home with, to sort of change their thinking, or something that should be in the back of their minds the next time they see, pictures on TV or the internet of a crisis or a disaster. How would you like them to look at it? What sort of slight change in thinking would you like to have taken part in today?
Start. Let's see here. That's a that's a tough one to end on, but I think for me it goes back to kind of the sentiments of Wangari Maathai, and thinking about it's very simple acts that we as individuals can do, that we can start at home. It could be a simple thing like planting trees. It can be a simple thing of just engaging in dialogue with our neighbors. And I think we've seen programmatically, little things like, bringing women together to start a savings group and opening up a space where, they have a safe space to talk about issues that are important to them. I think, these are very simple acts and interventions that really have a profound impact at a very micro level. And so maybe that's what I would want to leave them with, thinking about the simple things that can really have a great impact.
Yeah, I would say a quote from the residents of Flint: "We know what we need." They put together a 20-point plan in the aftermath of the crisis, where if that 20-point plan had been in place, the crisis never would have happened in the first place. So it includes, real sovereignty and governance of the community. It includes doing a community-wide environmental assessment, because the community is in the aftermath of a series of environmental toxins that are needed. It includes engaging around anti-racism conversations at the community level. And it just includes having the community in the lead of making its own decisions on its own behalf, because it knows what it wants. And this was 100% developed through a women-led process. The NAACP is 100% women-led. The Flint mayor is women, is a woman, and the community leaders who really were facilitating putting together that plan were all women, and but of course there were men there too. And so it was really, but the point was that it was a community-led, effort.
Yeah, that's a really tough question, because there's so many things I think that we've all spoken about that are very important. So I'll probably just re-echo a comment that I made earlier, was that, the first part is recognizing that climate change will have disproportionate impacts on women, right? That's the first step, and I think that we can all agree on that. But then the second component is that the adaptation response also has to have a gender component to it, so that during a disaster, prior to, during, and after a disaster, we understand how all of those impacts on women are going to occur, because, and echoing principles of sort of disaster risk management, right? It's employing that whole sort of cyclical approach, that if we can get it before, if we understand gender dynamics before a disaster occurs, that during a disaster we already know where to target, perhaps, women who are breastfeeding. How do we make sure that this super vulnerable community becomes less targeted? So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Swati, Jacqueline, and Kelly, for a wonderful panel. It's given everyone a lot to think about, and thank you, everyone here, for coming.